Ready to go.
Yeah, so good morning, everyone. I'm so happy to be able to talk to you about one of my favorite things this morning. I want to, like I told Katja this morning, I want to make sure you're aware that this is just going to be scratching the surface of herbalism, what we will be talking today, because that's a subject I could be talking to for days. But I want to introduce you to the basic herbal preparations you can make at home. Because most people are only familiar here with herbs that you buy in a health food store in a capsule or maybe in a tincture bottle, or you go out and look at them, and maybe hopefully you use them in your kitchen. You use culinary herbs in your kitchen, which to me, I love that, because as you may have already found out, most culinary herbs also have medicinal properties. So the reason why people used these herbs in the olden days was not just for flavor. They were also aware of the medicinal properties of those herbs. Of course, I love the flavor. So I want to go briefly over the many ways of using herbs and give you some examples. Herbs that I'm using right now, for instance, what's going on in my garden. There's rosemary here that I'm turning into rosemary vinegar. I have sage here that I make tea out of, which I'm drinking. That can be made into a vinegar too, or it can be just used to cook fish and many other things. And same with the rosemary. Rosemary is really great for chicken, for pork, for many other things. For potatoes, it's great on potatoes to roast them with. So as far as the culinary preparations, in most instances, if we can, we like to use the herbs fresh. Fresh is always better. There is a misconception I found with many people that they think in order to make an herbal tea, for instance, they think you have to dry the herbs first to make an herbal tea. That is a total misconception. It's just because we buy teas in dried form, it's only sold in dried form because it's more practical. But herb tea tastes much better when you make it from a fresh herb, as this sage that I just showed you, fresh out of the garden. You take a few sprigs or leaves, put it in a glass jar, in a heat-proof glass jar, such as that, and you pour boiling water over it. Like the simplest herb tea to make is you put the fresh herb in a glass jar, maybe a small handful in this jar. You pour boiling water over it, and then you let it sit for about 5 to 10 minutes. I like to let it sit for a little longer for stronger taste. The longer you let it sit, the stronger it's going to taste, and you're going to find your own time where you like the taste best. Now, you can just put the herbs in that glass jar, and then when it has steeped for the amount of time that you like, you could just use a strainer and strain it into a cup or a glass. Or if you want to be a little bit more fancy about it, instead of just putting them loosely into the glass jar, you could put them in something like that. You see that? That's like an herbal sock. These things you can buy. This is a cotton sock, and or you can make it yourself. It goes around a wire, and that wire fits the cup or the glass so it doesn't fall in. Comes in different sizes. And the reason why I like those cotton socks is they can actually be washed in hot bleach water and disinfected, because after a while, things might grow in there. So after every 10 uses or so, you can wash it and either in bleach water. What I prefer actually is hydrogen peroxide, much nicer than bleach. That also disinfects it, leaves no residue. And that way you don't have germs growing in that thing. Another much more fancy and more expensive device is this. This is, I think it's stainless steel. It's a very, very fine stainless steel mesh in a heat-proof plastic type that you can put inside your cup or wherever, and then just pull it out and toss that in the compost. So these are all ways to make herbal tea, which is one of the basic herbal preparations that I got introduced to herbs as a kid. And in our household, we drank herbal tea instead of sodas. Nobody drank sodas in our household. And as kids, we never got sodas. We got really nice herbal teas flavored with honey, and that was what we drank, hot or cold. And I'm still in that habit, and I love it. And there's a myriad different herbs you can use for herbal tea. You really have to experiment what you like and see what grows in your garden at the time and try a little bit with some hot water and see if you like it as a tea. Now that kind of preparation, that kind of herbal preparation technically is called an infusion. We call it tea, but it's technically an infusion. Infusion is when you put herbs into what's called a menstruum in herbology. A menstruum is the liquid that draws the properties out of the herbs, either flavor or medicinal properties. Everything that's good in the herbs gets drawn out into the menstruum when you soak the herb in that menstruum. So in the case of water, it's usually called tea. Sometimes it's called infusion. Herbalists call it infusion. Now you could infuse herbs in vinegar instead of water, and the effect will be what's called an herbal vinegar. Now an herbal vinegar, however, it's not that you necessarily heat up the vinegar to boiling and pour it over the herbs. Having a sip of herb tea, keep my whistle lubricated. Herbal vinegar is usually made by soaking your herbs that are first chopped up really fine or put in the blender with the vinegar, so they have more surface that the vinegar can work on. And you leave it in the vinegar for a minimum of 2 weeks and shake it every day so the vinegar can extract some of the good properties out of that. I like to use apple cider, raw apple cider vinegar, but honestly, you can use any vinegar. Even distilled white vinegar will do the trick. It's just gonna taste a little harsher. And it doesn't have all the beneficial properties of the apple cider vinegar, but it will also draw the properties out of the herbs. With an herbal vinegar, which is just an infusion of herbs in vinegar, after about 2 weeks or longer, you can let it sit in there for a month, then you would strain it. And I have a way to strain things that I set up specifically. I keep all my herbal preparation stuff actually separate from my kitchen stuff, so it doesn't get contaminated with grease or meat or anything like that. I have a box full of tools that I use only for herbal preparations. And one of my favorite setups is the straining setup. It consists of a cake mixing bowl, a strainer that fits exactly into that cake mixing bowl. Can you see that? And then on top of that, then I use what's called a flour sack towel. A flour sack towel is made out of linen or cotton, white, fairly tight weave that you strain things, because if you just do an herbal tea, you could just strain it in that strainer and that would be perfect. But if you make a tincture, there is things that might go through the strainer that you don't actually want in there. You want it strained better, so you put your flour sack towel into that. I'm putting the flour sack towel into the strainer. Do you see that? And then I put it into that thing. Then I pour my herbal vinegar or whatever I make in there. Most of it will just go through, and then the rest I can pick up. I can pick up this flour sack towel. Just assume you have a ball of herbal mash in there, and then you can strain that to get all the goodness out of your herbs. So don't use cheesecloth, because cheesecloth actually has bigger holes than the strainer and it'll be useless. So you want either what's called a flour sack towel, or you can use a really nice fine cotton or linen kitchen towel. Try to use something that doesn't have any colors, because the colors might be toxic. So try to use white or, not colored. And also I wash those things not with my regular laundry soap. I wash them only with like Dr. Bronner's or some really non-toxic soap, because no matter what you wash it with, there's always the possibility of a tiny soap residue in there, and you want to make sure that you're not getting any chemicals into your herbal infusion. So that's, one of my tools to strain, for instance, an infusion in vinegar, what we call an herbal vinegar. You've all seen herbal vinegars either at the farmer's market or in stores. You see a nice, pretty bottle with a liquid in it, and then you see one twig of an herb in it. And people mistakenly assume that this is how you make an herbal vinegar, that you fill a bottle with vinegar and then you put a twig of whatever herb you want in there, and that makes an herbal vinegar. Now that is not at all how it works, because the amount of herb that's on that twig is not nearly enough to get enough flavor and goodness into that vinegar. That twig is only in there for decoration. It has been put into the bottle after the vinegar has already been made. So the way an herbal vinegar is really made is you have a glass jar full of the herb you want to make the herbal vinegar with. This is just a canning jar here. And you can see when I use fresh herbs, you know, fresh juicy herbs, freshly harvested, this happens to be basil. You want to fill your glass jar pretty full with the herb. Can you see? This is almost full. Like it's, if I would stuff the basil down, this would be at least 2/3 full of fresh basil. And then I could pour the vinegar in, as much vinegar as I can get in there. You may want to take a wooden chopstick, make sure you get the air pockets out so that you really have vinegar in all the spaces. Really, I just picked that basil, so I didn't have time to chop it down. In reality, I would chop that very fine to make an herbal vinegar, or I would just put the vinegar with that basil, first measure the amount of vinegar I need, then put it all in the blender, blend it fine, and then let it macerate. It's another word for steep extract for 2 weeks. And during that time, I want to shake that every time I see it, because agitation is what gets the goodness out of it. Now, on a side note, these plastic lids that you can buy for the canning jars don't seal properly. So when you use one of those white plastic lids that you can buy for jam jars and you shake it, everything's gonna leak all over the place. That's my experience. So what I like to do is, I found out that there's a lot of other products that have lids that fit on regular canning jars, such as this. Do you see that? That's a lid from a pasta sauce. And that happens to fit on there. And guess what? It seals much better than this white plastic lid. With that, you can actually shake the jar and you don't have a mess all over the place. Or I found that this was the lid, the plastic lid of a mayonnaise jar. That happens to fit perfectly on a canning jar. And guess what? It seals perfectly. No mess when you shake it. So I took those 2 jars to show you that if you make an infusion or an herbal vinegar with fresh herbs, you want to fill the jar pretty full and then fill it up with the vinegar and let it steep for 2 weeks. If you use dried herbs, you only want to make it about half full. Why? Because the dried herbs are going to soak up a lot of liquid and they're going to swell up as they soak liquid. And you'll actually end up with more herbs in the jar than now, because when they are dry, they shrink. And when they you know, get some liquid into them, they expand again. So anyway, these lids that are on many jars that you buy, I save every lid from every jar I buy and see if it fits on a canning jar, and you'll be surprised many of them do. And they work better than the purchased ones. So, so that would be an infusion in vinegar, or a herbal vinegar as we call it. One more thing I want to mention is when you make herbal preparations, whether it's an herbal vinegar or an herbal oil, you always want to make sure that the steeping process, you know, when you let that sit in there for 2 weeks, that happens in a dark place, because light degrades the oil and the herbs. Light is one of the things that really degrades the oil and the herbs, and that's one of the biggest mistakes I see people making. I see in many places, they say, oh yeah, you fill this jar with vinegar and herbs, or let's say dried herbs and oil, and then you put it on your windowsill in the sun. That's a nice thought, but the sun and light is one of the main factors that actually degrade the chemical properties of that. So you're gonna get a much, much better product if you put it in a dark place. And one of the cheating ways to create a dark place for any jar is I put a little brown paper bag over the jar. So, you know, these little brown paper bags that you can buy at lunch bags, they're called lunch bags. You just take one of those brown paper bags and put it over the jar. And then you can put that jar right on the counter and it's in the dark. So when you make an infusion in oil instead of in a watery medium, let's say you want to make an herbal oil. This is dried marjoram from my garden. I'm just using it as an example. I would probably not make a marjoram oil, but I would make an oil out of calendula flowers or comfrey, or I would make an herbal oil out of something that I'm planning to use as a basis for a salve later. But just for demonstration purposes, I had the marjoram on hand, so I'm using that. When you make an herbal oil, you have to dry the herb before you make the herbal oil. Why? Because if you put fresh herbs into oil, fresh herbs contain water. When you put a thing that contains water in oil, it will grow mold really quickly. So your product will spoil within a week or so. And you can actually poison yourself. So, whereas if you put fresh herbs in vinegar, the vinegar, because it's so acidic, preserves it and prevents the growth of mold. Or later, as we get to herbal tincture is basically an infusion in alcohol. You don't have that problem either. If you use alcohol like vodka, there's no spoilage. Not only is there no spoilage, it'll last for years. Vinegar lasts, a vinegary infusion lasts in the fridge for, I would say, a year. Now, an herbal oil, we want to dry the herbs. And you can see here, this is really dry marjoram. It needs to be dry enough to be crispy before you infuse it into oil. But otherwise, the infusion works exactly the same way. With dry herbs, you only want to use a half a jar full because they expand. I would fill the rest of the jar with olive oil. I like to use olive oil, a good olive oil. And again, you want to keep it in the dark and then agitate it daily, because otherwise everything will clump together on the bottom in a clump and no extraction will happen. The extraction will happen through the daily agitation. One fun way I found to make tinctures and herbal oils, when I still lived in Los Angeles, I spent a lot of time driving around town to my clients. I had a private practice in Los Angeles for almost 20 years. And as you can imagine, the way the traffic is there, I spent about 3 hours a day in the car driving, being stuck on the freeway. But one of the good things was I made all my herbal preparations in the car because the driving process agitated the herbal preparations automatically. So I had a milk crate in the car, and that milk crate contained all my herbal oils, tinctures, etc. And I had a big sweater over it so it would be dark. And every time you drive with that car, your herbs get agitated. No need to shake them. So that, you know, is a fun way to do it if you spend a lot of time driving. Anyway, everything kind of flows into everything here. But I'm trying to kind of stick to my list, so make sure I cover everything. So that was infusion. Simple infusion, a cup of tea. Let's say you want to make a cup of tea out of something that's a little harder, that doesn't give its properties up to the water so easily. As an example, let's say cinnamon bark or fennel seeds make a fantastic tea. So you have fennel growing in your garden, you can use the seeds to make a really great tea that is antispasmodic, is great for gas, or against gas, I should say. You would put a teaspoonful of these fennel seeds per cup of water or per 1.5 cups of water. And fennel actually, when the seeds are still fresh, they still work with just pouring boiling water over it. But you have to let it sit a little bit longer than leafy material to get all the goodness out of it, because it's a harder material. Now, the harder it gets, let's say you use a bark, such as cinnamon bark, just pouring some boiling water over chunks of cinnamon bark is not gonna extract that really well. So what we do with these harder materials to make teas out of, it's called a decoction. And what a decoction is, you put your herbs and your water in a pot. I love to use glass pots for herbs because they are non-reactive. See that? I bought like a dozen of those at a thrift store once for very cheap. And those glass pots are really great for herbal preparations. They come in all sizes. I love glass with herbs because it's non-reactive. So no matter whether your preparation is acidic or alkaline, there's no chemicals from the pot going in there. So you would put your cinnamon bark for a decoction into the pot, add the water, and then you bring it to almost a boil. We call that a slight simmer, right? I mean, it just, when the water surface just starts to fluctuate a little bit and it's like almost boiling, but not quite, then you want to leave it at that almost boiling stage for about 10-15 minutes. Don't let it boil. With cinnamon, actually, if it boils accidentally, no big deal. It's not going to hurt the product. But there's other herbs that if you actually bring them to a boil, it's going to destroy the active ingredients. So you want to keep it just under the boiling point and just let that simmer for about 10-15 minutes, and then you strain it. That's called a decoction. And a decoction is used for all the tough material, you know, such as barks. Another thing you can do with fresh herbs, and I forgot to get some out from my garden, and I don't want to take the time now. There's a weed growing out in most of your gardens, like in mine. I let it grow because I know the medicinal properties it has. It's called plantain. It comes in two forms. It comes in the narrow leaf form. It's called narrow leaf or English plantain. And then there's a broadleaf form, broadleaf plantain. And they both have the same properties. They are great chelators that can be used to draw the poison out of insect bites, itches, rashes, etc. And one of the simplest ways to use those is as a poultice. Let's say you got an insect bite on your hand, then you take that plantain leaf, and to make the simplest, most, something smells burnt here.
Baking or cooking.
Oh, my husband's cooking, it smells burnt. Anyway, it smells very burnt, so you may want to check that. So to make a really simple poultice, you take that plantain leaf and you just chew it into a mash in your mouth, and then you take that mash and put it right on that insect bite. Press it on there, and you let it sit there for a while, and you'll notice that
Gabrielle, does it look like a plantain? The leaves? Does it look like a plantain?
If you Google plantain, like I said, I have one in the garden, but it's going to take too long to go out, and I don't want to get dirty fingers right now because I'm on my computer. But it's really easy to recognize. It has these longitudinal fibers in the leaf, really strong longitudinal fibers. And so, like I said, one of the easiest ways to use it is just to chew it up. Plantain, you can also add it to your smoothie. You can
I can show a picture if everybody is interested in seeing it.
Yeah, if you Google it, you'll find the picture. It's easy to find.
Yeah, I'm interested. This is Millie. And what's the name of the plant? I know I did. Oh, plantain. Okay.
Plantain.
Plantain.
Millie, you would be interested to hear that it was called white man's footsteps. Because wherever the white people came, they brought that weed with them from Europe. Yeah, that's it. Exactly. I'm sure you've all seen it, right?
I probably have.
And many people think it's just a pesky weed.
And then
it's a really great medicinal plant.
So you chew it and then put it on your bite?
You chew it and then put that chewed cud right on the insect bite.
Oh, okay.
Or on the itchy spot, wherever you have an itchy spot, you just put it right on there. Of course, you can make a much more sophisticated poultice, okay? The way herbalism teaches to make poultices, yeah, that's plantain.
Is that plant out now?
More sophisticated, huh? I can't hear you, Millie.
Is that plant out now, or when does it come out?
Well, it's in my garden now, but it would not be in the wild in Lake County now because it needs water. So it grows as a weed in my garden in the places where I water. But without water, it would long be gone. If you don't water a certain area, you may see it in the spring, and then it dries up, you know. It's a plant that comes from Northern Europe, Eurasia, and it does not thrive in the dry climate of Lake County. But it thrives in my vegetable garden because there's water there. So if you want some, I have 1 million seeds, you know, it's not hard to come by. But just look for it in the spring. You'll see it growing many places wild in the spring, and then it just dries up as soon as the water dries up. So you can make a poultice out of almost any herb that's used for external applications, like, you know, to soothe itchy skin or something. And a more sophisticated poultice would be made by blending, mashing the herb, and then you can mix it with something that makes it sticky, such as, you know how when you grind flax seeds and then you add water to ground flax seeds, it turns into a really sticky porridge. So ground flax seeds can be mixed in with any herbal poultice to make it stick, to make it into something that sticks to your skin. The other thing you can use is slippery elm, which is something you would need to buy. You know, you can't get that at your grocery store, but you know, slippery elm is used by many herbalists to use as a sticking thing to make poultices. But flaxseed, ground flaxseed works just fine. And flax has its own medicinal properties, so it's almost better, I think. Slippery elm also, it's just a soothing herb, but it creates a mucilaginous sticky goop when you add water, and that's why it's used for making poultices stick. But like I said, when you chew the thing in your mouth, it turns into a sticky thing just from your saliva by itself, and you actually don't need all this fancy stuff. The other preparation that I like to make with herbs is a tincture. And the reason why I like to tincture some herbs is because that gives them basically almost indefinite shelf life. And it draws, it's basically an infusion in alcohol, or an alcoholic extract, you could call it. And the reason is, number one, it makes for indefinite shelf life. Number two, the alcohol draws things out of the herb that are not water soluble. So a lot of the, you know, phytochemicals in the herb that are not water soluble are soluble in alcohol. So when you make a tincture in alcohol, you get more goodness out of most herbs than you would with just water. And the alcohol I like to use for tinctures, and that most people use, is vodka, believe it or not. And I don't want to advertise for any particular brand, but you can see this is the cheapest vodka you can buy at the store. You don't want any flavored vodka. You actually do not want expensive flavored vodka, because it's not about the vodka. It's about just drawing the properties out of the herbs. So the blander the alcohol is, the better. Most other alcohols already are saturated with flavors from whatever they've been made out of. And vodka is one of the blandest, cheapest alcohols. That's why it's a good thing to make tinctures out of. Some tinctures need a higher percentage of alcohol than you can get in vodka. And for that, you would buy something called Everclear. It's very hard to get here. In Los Angeles, there was a wine store that used to sell Everclear, and I would always go there and buy whatever they had to have it on hand for my tinctures. In Lake County, honestly, I'm not sure where you can buy Everclear, but for most things, you don't need it. You only need the higher percentage alcohol to get to make extracts with things like, for instance, barks and very hard materials that have resins that need a higher percentage of alcohol to dissolve than you have in vodka. But for your average tincture, cheap vodka works just fine. And the way you make the tincture is exactly like you would make your herbal vinegar. You know, you fill your jar with herb. Now remember, I just harvested this from the garden. What I would really do is I would take these herbs, put it in the blender with the vodka, and add just enough vodka so I can blend it up. So you don't want to make a tincture where you have a glass full of vodka and then 3 leaves of herb in it. That's completely useless. You need to get enough herbal material in there to get enough phytochemicals in there. And that means with fresh herb, you need to have the jar like 2/3 at least full of herb. And then fill it up with vodka, and then put the whole thing in the blender, blend it up, put it back in the jar. And then you put your brown paper bag over it, or just put it in a dark closet. But my experience is if I put it in a dark closet, I forget about it and I don't shake it. The only way to not forget about it is have it right in front of my nose or put it in my car. And so if you put it on the counter where it's light, just put a brown paper bag over it. Sometimes I make tinctures, I used to make it in huge containers, and I would put an old t-shirt over it to keep it dark. So then when you have it blended up with your vodka, then you put it in your jar, shake it every day. Several times a day is good, but even once a day is fine. And you need to let it sit there and macerate for a minimum of 2 weeks. I let some tinctures sit for 3 months. But a minimum of 2 weeks, you need to get all the good stuff out of it. Longer is better. And then when you feel you have gotten enough good stuff into solution, then you strain it with the same thing again, you know, your container with the fitting strainer, and put your flour sack towel in it. And then you pour the contents in it. And at that point, you'll have a big mush. And then you gather your flour sack towel and really squeeze it out. And that you'll see it's gonna be hard to squeeze some of that. You have to really squeeze to get the last drop out of it, because the best stuff is really still clinging to the herbs. And then when you've squeezed as much out as you can squeeze out, you fill it into bottles. I like dark bottles because, again, light degrades herbs. So I like to put it in a dark bottle. This is a tincture I made. This is Angelica. I know you can't read it here. Angelica sinensis. It's a tincture I made actually years ago, and it's still good because it was in a cool spot in a dark jar. And then eventually, as you use it, you know, you're going to fill it in tincture bottles like that, right? This is a 2-ounce tincture bottle. This is a 1-ounce tincture bottle, where you have a dropper in there that you can then dose it, you know. This is stuck together. You know those tincture bottles, this is how you buy tinctures. They're all kind of stuck together because I had some sticky tincture in there. But you get the idea. It has a pipette that you can dose it. Most of these tinctures, while I have the bottle here, I want to mention that there's hardly any herbal tincture I'm aware of where you just use drops. The amount that you need to have a good effect with almost any herb I'm aware of is at least a dropper full. And a dropper full is, it's not a Swiss watch, but you basically squeeze this thing together, suck up in the bottle. There's nothing in there in this bottle, but basically a dropper full is whatever you end up in the pipette with after you suck up in the bottle. It's usually about half full when you take it out of the bottle. That's called a dropper full. It's not really full, it's usually half full, but it's as much as you can suck up. And that's called a dropper full. And most herbal preparations I take 2 dropper fulls 3 times a day. That would be a typical dosage for a lot of these herbal preparations. Not like some people think like 2 drops every day. That will have virtually 0 effect. So, but I'm not getting too much into medicinal tinctures and dosages now, because that would be like a 3-week class. But just so to give you an idea of how much of that stuff you actually need to do some good, right? So one thing I like to do is when I make herbal tinctures with alcohol, or actually even herbal vinegars, I like to strain them on the full moon. Why? Because on the full moon, the moon tends to pull things out into solution. And when you strain them on or around the full moon, you have the highest concentration of phytochemicals in your menstruum. So that's why I like to do that. Strict herbalists say you should start on the new moon and finish on the full moon. Well, when you gather your herbs, it's not always new moon. You know what I mean? I gather them whenever they need to be gathered and whenever I need them. So sometimes it happens to be new moon, but very often not. But I try to strain them on the full moon because that, I feel, gives the highest potency you can get out of the herbs. That is a tincture. In the material I gave you, there is a link to a YouTube video by an herbalist named Cami McBride, and she shows you exactly how to make an herbal tincture. It's not that difficult, but I just basically told you in simple steps, but it's good to have a video that you can watch again and remind yourself of the basics. So there's a good tincture making video on there. Again, once you have your ready-made product, you want to store it in a dark bottle, in a dark place. Room temperature is fine. An alcoholic herbal tincture will, at like 65 degrees, be good for 2 years, at least, you know, because the alcohol preserves it. Now, an herbal vinegar, I like to refrigerate my herbal vinegars, and refrigerated, I found them to be good for at least a year, usually up to 2 years. And The third application that we talked about, an herbal oil. Remember I said when you make an herbal oil, you need to have the herbs dried first. Very important, because if you use fresh herbs, there's many YouTube videos out there of wannabe herbalists who tell you to just throw your fresh herbs in the oil and make an herbal oil. And you'll end up having mold growing in there, and you can really do some harm to yourself. So dry your herbs before you make the herbal oil. Then after you strain it, your herbal oil also wants to be stored in a dark container. And herbal oils, actually, I store in the refrigerator. And I like to even store it in a dark, sometimes in an even darker glass container than that. In the refrigerator, it doesn't matter because it's usually dark in there. And these herbal oils, I make usually as a basis for salves. Because to make a salve, where's my salve now? This is a salve I just made a couple of weeks ago. It's my basic herbal healing salve. And the herbs I use in there are calendula, comfrey, chickweed, plantain. That's the stuff that grows around here wild, you know, and I encourage it. So I make herbal oils out of these plants. And then the herbal oil is thickened with beeswax. That's what turns it into a salve. This smells wonderful. I use it as a face cream on my face. I use it as an all over thing, actually. I don't just use that for strains and things, but I use it as a face cream, as a body lotion if necessary, and you need only a tiny amount for it. Now, the way to make an herbal salve is a whole class by itself. The farmer's market manager, Cornelia Sieber, has asked me to do a salve making class this fall or winter at the farmer's market. And we have not set a date and time yet, but I'm thinking I'm probably going to do it end of November, beginning of December. Reason being, because then when you make your salve, you have a nice present for your friends and relatives to give away. But in the meantime, before the class, you could start making some herbal oils already, because the herbal oils that you make will be the basis for the salve. Now, to make the salve, you will, you know, it used to be that people said you need these things like a double boiler, right? This is a double boiler pot that fits in there. The water goes in the bottom and then your oil goes in the pot on top. I have a bunch of those, but you don't actually need that. You can use simply a pot such as this one, and this is a canning jar. Canning jars are heat proof. So you can put that canning jar into your pot and create a primitive double boiler. Now that has the problem that there's water in this pot around the canning jar, and when the water starts boiling, sometimes the boiling water, you end up getting water into the oil, which you don't want. So that is kind of tricky to do. What I actually prefer is to use a pot a little bigger than that. I don't have it right here. And then use a heat-proof glass measuring jar. And can you see when you put these together, you have a makeshift double boiler. The reason why we make this stuff in double boilers is because you don't want to heat up your oils and your waxes to the point where it cooks all the good ingredients out of it. They have to be heated very gingerly. So a double boiler has water in the lower container, and then your oil and your wax in the upper container. So that container with the herbal oil and the wax sits on top of simmering water. And it slowly heats up and melts on top of that simmering water. If you would put the ingredients directly into your pot on the stove, you would just burn the bottom and make a big sticky mess. But since it sits on the boiling water, it slowly melts. And the way most people do salves, they pour all the ingredients in there and just wait till the wax melts and then stir it up and fill it in jars. The wax we use is beeswax, and I used to buy that from beekeepers in blocks like that, but I found out that these blocks are almost impossible to cut into the kind of chunks you need. I mean, I almost cut my finger off many times trying to do that. So now I buy the wax in little granules like that. Can you see that? Those are little granules of beeswax, and you can buy that. If you want to know where, I can tell you where. I don't want to advertise for any particular place, but beeswax granule can be bought online, or you can buy chunks. This is from a beekeeper, chunks that he used to buy before. When you make a huge amount of salve, you can use a chunk like that. But for most people, they just make a small amount, and all you need is like a tablespoonful of these granules. And so how most people make their salves is, you know, they have their double boiler, you put your herbal oil in there and warm it up. The other thing you need for it absolutely is a candy thermometer, because you need to keep track of the exact temperature. This is a candy thermometer. So when I slowly heat that up, I always have my thermometer in there to make sure it doesn't get too hot. Now, you want to heat the herbal oil to no more than 125, 128 degrees max, because if you heat it more than that, you're going to destroy the beneficial properties of that. The challenge is that wax does not melt until it gets to about 140 degrees, okay? So if you make your salve the simple way most people do, meaning you throw the oil and the wax in that pot together, that means by the time the wax finally melts, the oil has also reached 140 degrees, which is not really good for the herbal properties in the oil. And that's why I like to make my salves with two different pots. In one of those, I heat up the oil to about 125 degrees. And in the other one, I heat up the wax till it melts to about 140 degrees, because that's what it takes for the wax to melt. And then I add the melted wax to the 125 degree oil and mix it up, which will mix up just fine. That way you have not overheated your oil. Okay, now this is a step that most herbalists omit. And I'm not saying if you heat it together that your salve will be totally useless. You know, olive oil by itself has medicinal properties, and so does beeswax. So it will still be an okay product, but it's going to be a much higher quality product if you heat up the oil and the wax separately and then pour it together. You know, you save more of the beneficial properties of the herbal oil. And how to do that is something I'm going to demonstrate sometime this winter at the farmer's market. And Cornelia has said that she will film it. So even if you don't make it there, she'll probably put the video on YouTube so you can see that. That is something that I do regularly. And the herbs I use as a bit. So what you need for this salve is the herbal oil, beeswax. And then I like to add, as it cools down a little bit before I put it into little jars, you know, you can put it into jars like this, tins like that, or just, I usually use little canning jars. Those little quarter-pint canning jars are nice. The tins are okay if you don't use essential oils, then the tin works fine. When I use essential oils in my salve, I'm actually not crazy about tins because the essential oil can react with the metal of the tin, which is not great. So if you use a lot of essential oils in your salve, it's better to put it in a glass jar rather than a tin like that. If you just have a tiny amount of essential oil in there, you'll be okay. And the essential oils I like to use in my salves are my 3 favorite essential oils for salves, which are the best oils for skincare, are things like tea tree oil, geranium oil, lavender oil, and lemon essential oil. That's my 4. I would say my 4 favorites for salves, because all those 4 have fantastic properties for skin healing. Lavender essential oil alone is an anti-burn remedy. Geranium oil alone increases circulation, stops bleeding, has all kinds of has a rejuvenating effect on the skin. Tea tree oil, you probably all know, is antifungal. And lemon also has mildly antifungal and antibiotic properties. Another thing I like to add is pine resin. If you can get a hold of pine resin, just in a very small amount, that is basically used as a natural preservative. Even though for salves, you don't need a natural preservatives because the beeswax is the natural preservative. And salves, such as this one, will store at room temperature for a year at least. If you want to keep it longer than a year, you can put it in the refrigerator, but at room temperature, this will last for a year because of the beeswax. that I think is all we're gonna cover today. And I have a couple minutes for questions. I gave you some handouts where you can recap what I was talking about. And if you come to the salve making demo at the farmer's market, when we do that, you can, watch and ask me questions. And if you have any questions right now, go ahead.
When is the salve making class?
I have not set a date, Jamali, but Cornelia said that we said that probably end of November, beginning of December, because people probably want to use this as a Christmas gift. So when you make it at that time, it's nice. Then, when you do that, you have a Christmas gift for people. And so I will do a little demonstration, and depending on how much we make, maybe give away a few tins. But there you can see, because, it's easier to learn things watching somebody than just listening. I realize that there's nothing like just watching somebody do it. So I will let you know when that is. We haven't set the date. But like I said, this is not rocket science. Herbalism is kind of like cooking. If you know how to do a recipe from a YouTube video, you can make an herbal product. It's not that different. And if you have a question, I'll be happy to answer your question. You can, you know how to get a hold of me.
Yeah, there's
Anybody
a
have any
question
questions
from
right now?
Kim. She wants to know she gets the handout and the recording. I think the recording Katja is gonna send the recording after, but she wants to know how she gets the handout.
The handout, okay. So if you have an email list of the participants, Katja, do you have an email list of the participants?
Yes, I have an email.
I sent you the handouts.
Yep.
Could you email those handouts?
Yeah. Yes, I'll be emailing
so Katja
everyone
is
the handouts and the recording from today.
Okay. Yeah, and you'll see pretty much almost everything I said is in those handouts. There's one more thing I wanted to show you just while I think about it. Drying herbs. Do you know what this is? It's a cheap little clothes hanger that I bought in Chinatown someday. And I don't use it that much anymore because I have a better one now, but this is how I started out with. So when you dry herbs, you make little bundles. Let's say you have some stalks of my sage that you want to dry. You take 3 of those stalks and you tie them together with some string. And then I put a brown paper bag over it. I cut a slit in that brown paper bag in the top so I can put it from the bottom in the brown paper bag and the string comes out the top. And then I hang those bundles of herbs from this clothes dryer, and I just hang it in a dark closet or somewhere away from the light. I actually like to hang it near my fan because they dry the easiest when there's a lot of air circulation, and this is an easy way to dry herbs. Of course, you can also get fancy and put them in your Excalibur dehydrator, which I sometimes do when I need it fast. But I have another herb dryer which I like now. And it's funny, everybody who sees it says, oh yeah, it's the cannabis herb dryer. When I bought it, I wasn't aware that it was used by cannabis growers, but I guess it is. What it is, it's a cylindrical, it's a big mesh cylinder that I have hanging in my living room. And it has 6 different shelves. It's a mesh cylinder with mesh shelves. And I just lay those herbs on the mesh shelves. And because we always have a fan on next to it, within a week or so, and it's in a dark corner, so within a week or so, those herbs are perfectly dry. And you can tell a good quality dry herb by looking at the color. If it's all brown, it's garbage and it has lost all its good properties. When you start out with green sage leaves and you dry them carefully, they still have to be green when they're dry. And in order to achieve that, you have to keep them away from light. If you put this in the sun to dry, it'll shrivel up and get brown, and then it has no more, medicinal properties. It's useless. So stuff that's dried outside because it died and dried does not have any beneficial properties. It still needs to look green, but be crisp. Just like this marjoram here. See that? It's dried marjoram. It still just has the same color as when it was alive, but it's crispy dry. Let's see, anything else I was gonna show you? Oh yeah, and another herbal preparation. You know, you all know Ricola, right? Ricola is an herbal preparation. It's basically an herb extracted in sugar syrup. Now this is not a Ricola. This is a German herbal candy I bought on my last vacation by a guy who made them right there. Funny, huh? They're cute. But you know, that's also an herbal preparation. I don't call that medicinal because if you infuse an herb in sugar, you're basically pretty much negating most of the medicinal effect. But it still tastes good, right? Any questions? I think we gotta finish now because you have another Zoom class coming
That's
up.
correct.
Right?
We have to start wrapping up. We've got another Zoom class for the youth
Yeah.
right after this. If anyone has any questions, feel free to email me. I'll be emailing everyone shortly with today's handouts and recording. So if you have any questions, let me know and I'll pass it along to Gabrielle.
All right, folks. You're all herbalists now. Have fun with it. See you soon.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
You're welcome.